How do you beat the best gunman in the state? Andrew Jackson's solution: let him shoot you first. He took a bullet straight to the chest, clamped his hand over the wound gushing blood, and then slowly took aim and killed the man who was watching in horror. In the year 1835, the President of the United States was a walking cemetery. Andrew Jackson did not simply walk, he rattled. Within his desiccated frame, beneath the formal broadcloth of his office, lead bullets shifted and rolled, souvenirs from 100 duels and skirmishes, lodged too deep in muscle and bone to ever be retrieved. With every sharp movement, they made a quiet, dull percussion, like a pouch of pebbles. He was in a constant state of coughing, spitting clots of crimson blood into a fine cambric handkerchief. This man, who held dominion over the destiny of a nation, was a physical ruin, a living museum of violence, his body a map of his own brutal history. It was a sound few ever heard, a subtle, ghostly noise that was masked by the creak of floorboards or the rustle of papers. But for the man himself, it was a constant companion, an internal reminder of the price of his honor and his rage. It was the sound of a past that would not heal, of grievances that had become a part of his very anatomy. This quiet rattle was a profound contradiction to the booming, decisive voice of the president, a secret percussive beat beneath the official rhythm of the nation. It was a sound that belonged to the frontier brawling pit, not the executive mansion. The lead was not inert. It was a slow, seeping poison that had been working on him for decades. It leached into his blood, fueling the chronic fevers, the debilitating headaches, and the constant, gnawing pain that sharpened the edges of his already volatile temper. His famous iron will was forged not just in battle, but in a daily, private war against his own body. He governed a country while his own internal state was in a perpetual state of rebellion, the foreign metal inside him a constant source of insurrection against his flesh. The pain was a furnace that fueled his legendary fury. Then there was the cough. It was not the gentle clearing of a throat but a deep, racking spasm that shook his entire gaunt frame. It would come upon him without warning, in the middle of a cabinet meeting or during a quiet evening moment. He would turn his head, his face contorting, and bring the handkerchief to his lips. When he pulled it away, the white cloth would be stained with a fresh bloom of red. It was the physical evidence of the bullet that lay nested near his heart, a wound that never closed, a constant, slow-motion hemorrhage that he had endured for nearly 30 years. To the public, he was Old Hickory, an emblem of the tough, unbreakable frontier spirit. He was the hero of New Orleans, the man of the people, a figure of mythic strength and resolve. They saw the rigid posture, the fierce, piercing blue eyes, and the grim, determined set of his jaw. They did not see the way his hand trembled from pain when he thought no one was looking, or the sheen of sweat on his brow from a sudden fever. His entire presidency was a masterful performance, an act of supreme willpower, concealing the crumbling ruin of the man within the unyielding icon. His body was a historical document written in scar tissue and lead. One bullet was from a tavern brawl in his youth. Another was from a vicious frontier duel that had been more of a standing gunfight. The deepest, the one that caused the bleeding, was a relic of a cold-blooded affair of honor. Each piece of metal was a marker, a tombstone for a man he had killed or an enemy who had tried to kill him. To understand the geography of his flesh was to understand the violent, unforgiving world that had created him and which he, in turn, had shaped with his own hands. This living archive of violence now sat in the highest office in the land. His story was forged in fire and blood from its very beginning. Born on the violent, ill-defined frontier of the Carolinas, his world was one of hardship and conflict. There was no gentle introduction to life. He was a child of the borderlands, a place where civilization was a thin veneer over a landscape of raw survival. His earliest memories were not of peaceful farm life, but of the alarms of war, of stories of raids and massacres, of a world where man's life was cheap and his honor was everything. This harsh environment was the crucible that shaped the iron of his character. At the age of 13, a boy barely on the cusp of manhood, he was swept up into the brutal reality of the Revolutionary War. He was not a soldier in a formal sense, but a courier, a young rider carrying messages for the local militia. It was a dangerous job for a boy, but it was in his nature to be in the thick of the action. Captured by the British along with his older brother Robert, he was taken to a makeshift prison camp. It was here, in captivity, that the defining moment of his youth would occur, an incident that would crystallize the defiant rage that would fuel the rest of his life. He received his first major scar not in the heat of battle, but in a cold, deliberate act of personal rebellion. A British officer, the very embodiment of the aristocratic arrogance he would come to despise, pointed to his own mud-caked boots and ordered the boy to clean them. It was a command meant to humiliate, to assert dominance. The boy, his eyes blazing with a fury far older than his years, refused. The response was immediate and savage. The officer drew his saber and slashed at the defiant prisoner, the blade cutting deep into the boy's head and hand as he raised his arm to protect himself. The physical wounds were deep, leaving scars he would carry for the rest of his life as a visible reminder of this early injustice. But the psychological wound was far deeper. It was a lesson seared into his young mind, that authority was often arbitrary and cruel, that submission was a form of death, and that defiance, even in the face of overwhelming power, was the only true measure of a man's worth. This single, violent encounter planted a seed of implacable hatred for the British in particular, and for any form of perceived tyranny in general. The horrors of his captivity were not over. The prison camp was a pestilent place, and both he and his brother contracted smallpox. They were released as part of a prisoner exchange, not as an act of mercy, but because they were dying and no longer of any use. Their mother, a woman of formidable frontier fortitude, had arranged the exchange and met them on the road. They were so sick they could barely ride, two skeletal boys burning with fever. She managed to get them home, but it was too late for his brother. Robert died within 2 days, his death another black mark against the British in the boy's grieving heart. His mother, having just buried one son, then set out on a 200-mile journey to Charleston to nurse other sick and wounded relatives held on British prison ships. It was an act of incredible courage and self-sacrifice. But the pestilence of the prison ships claimed her as well. She contracted cholera and died, buried in an unmarked grave far from her home. The news, when it reached him, was the final, devastating blow. At the age of 14, he was utterly alone in the world, an orphan of the war, his entire immediate family wiped out by the conflict. The boy was left with nothing but the clothes on his back, the scars on his body, and a cold, all-consuming hatred that settled deep in his heart. It was a profound and formative rage, not the hot, fleeting anger of a teenager, but a deep, structural fury that became the central pillar of his personality. This hatred was the engine that would drive his ambition, his politics, his violence, and his entire life. The world had shown him no mercy, so he would show it none in return. The orphan boy of the Carolina frontier would spend the rest of his life seeking retribution for the family the war had stolen from him. This raw, untutored rage was his only inheritance. It gave him a terrifying focus and a complete fearlessness. Having already lost everything, he had nothing left to lose. He grew into a tall, gangling, red-headed young man with a hair-trigger temper and a fierce sense of personal honor that was, in reality, an externalization of his internal wounds. Any perceived slight, any challenge to his word or his character, was met with an immediate and often violent response. He was projecting the defenseless boy who had been slashed by a saber, and he was determined to never be defenseless again. He drifted for a time, squandering a small inheritance on gambling and hard living, a young man at war with a world that had orphaned him. But the same fierce intelligence and unyielding will that fueled his rages also fueled his ambition. He began to study law, seeing it not as a system of abstract justice, but as a weapon, a tool for imposing order on a chaotic world and for advancing his own power within it. He was admitted to the bar and set his sights on the frontier territory of Tennessee, a place as wild, violent, and full of brutal possibility as he was. There, in the rough-and-tumble world of the frontier, his volatile temperament and his rigid code of honor found a perfect home. This was a society where disputes were often settled not in a courtroom, but with fists, knives, or pistols. His willingness to defend his honor to the death, a trait forged in the crucible of his childhood trauma, was not seen as a flaw, but as a sign of strength and leadership. The very rage that had almost destroyed him as a boy was now becoming the foundation of his reputation, the source of his power, and the instrument of his rise. This primal hatred found its perfect outlet in the brutal honor code of the frontier. In this world, a man's reputation was his most valuable asset, the very currency of his existence, and it had to be defended with a ferocity that bordered on the suicidal. For a man like Jackson, whose inner world was a landscape of unresolved trauma and rage, this code was not a social convention, it was a necessary external armor. He engaged in countless brawls, disputes, and affairs of honor, his life a running battle against a constant stream of perceived slights. His readiness to resort to violence was legendary, a clear signal that he was a man who would not be trifled with. In the year 1806, his path collided with that of Charles Dickinson. The dispute began over a horse race and a forfeited bet, a trivial matter that quickly spiraled into a bitter and very public feud. But the true heart of the conflict was Dickinson's insults against Jackson's wife, Rachel. Dickinson had made remarks about the complicated circumstances of the Jacksons' marriage, a deeply sensitive subject. In doing so, he had targeted the one area of Jackson's life where there was a semblance of tenderness and vulnerability. He had, in essence, signed his own death warrant. Dickinson was not just any man. He was widely regarded as the finest marksman in all of Tennessee, perhaps in the entire country. He was a duelist of considerable experience, with a reputation for killing several men. He was young, handsome, and arrogant, supremely confident in his ability to dispatch Jackson as he had others. The insult was public, the challenge was inevitable, and the entire state of Tennessee watched with morbid fascination as the two men prepared to meet. This was not to be a simple affair of honor. It was to be a gladiatorial contest between two of the state's most prominent figures. They met at dawn in a clearing in Kentucky, having crossed the state line to evade Tennessee's anti-dueling laws. The air was cold and still. The rules were simple and savage. They would stand facing each other at a distance of 24 feet. At the word, they could fire at will. Dickinson, supremely confident, believed he could wound Jackson and still have time to reload if necessary. Jackson, on the other hand, was a competent shot, but he knew he was no match for Dickinson's legendary speed and accuracy. He had spent the previous evening devising a strategy, a cold, terrifying calculus of survival and revenge. Jackson entered the dueling ground wearing a loose-fitting overcoat, a deliberate choice. He knew Dickinson would aim for the heart, the classic duelist's target. The baggy coat, he reasoned, might obscure the exact location of his lean torso, causing the bullet to strike a less than fatal spot. But the core of his plan was far more audacious and chilling. He had made the decision, in the cold silence of the night, to allow Dickinson to shoot him first. He would take the bullet, absorb the impact, and rely on his own inhuman willpower to remain standing long enough to take his own, careful, and fatal shot. The seconds at the dueling ground gave the word. Dickinson, as expected, fired almost instantly. His aim was true. The .70 caliber lead ball struck Jackson squarely in the chest with a dull, sickening thud, a sound that was clearly audible to the horrified witnesses. The impact was immense, a physical blow that would have sent most men crashing to the ground. A puff of dust flew from Jackson's coat. The witnesses saw his left hand fly up to his chest, and they saw a dark stain begin to spread across the fabric of his shirt. But he did not fall. He did not even flinch. He remained standing, as rigid and unmoving as an iron statue. Dickinson, his face now a mask of disbelief and horror, recoiled. "My God," he stammered, "have I missed him?" He was forced by the code of the duel to remain in his place, a stationary target, as Jackson, his face a grim mask of pure, murderous intent, slowly raised his own pistol. Jackson took his time. He cocked the hammer, and as he did so, he calmly used his left hand to clamp down on the wound in his chest, stemming the flow of blood that was now pouring from his body. With a deliberation that seemed to defy the very laws of biology, he took careful aim at the terrified, unmoving figure of Charles Dickinson. He squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell, but there was only a click. The pistol had misfired, stopping at half-cock. Under the strict rules of the duel, this should have counted as his shot. Dickinson should have been a free man. But Jackson, his will absolute and his intent murderous, was not interested in the niceties of the code. He recocked the pistol. The witnesses, frozen in a mixture of awe and terror, did nothing to stop him. Jackson took aim a second time, his focus absolute, his body screaming in agony but his mind a shard of cold, clear ice. He fired again. This time, the pistol discharged correctly. The ball struck Dickinson in the abdomen, a wound that was almost always fatal in that era before modern surgery. Dickinson collapsed to the ground, mortally wounded. He would linger in agony for the rest of the day before dying. Jackson, meanwhile, turned and walked away from the field without a word, his own wound still gushing blood, his boot squelching with it. It was only when he was out of sight of the dueling ground that he allowed his own body to betray the extent of his injury, nearly fainting from blood loss. The bullet from Dickinson's pistol had shattered two of his ribs and lodged itself just millimeters from his heart. The doctors who attended him were astonished that he was still alive. They feared that any attempt to remove the ball would be fatal. And so, it remained where it was, a permanent, painful resident in his body, a constant source of the chest pain and the bloody cough that would plague him for the rest of his days. But that bullet, and the manner in which he had received it, became the foundation of his legend. He was no longer just a tough frontier politician. He was a man who could be shot through the chest and still kill you. Dickinson's bullet had fractured 2 ribs and embedded itself just centimeters from his heart. The attending physicians, working with the crude instruments and limited knowledge of the era, were astonished that he had survived the initial impact, let alone the walk from the dueling ground. They probed the wound but quickly concluded that any attempt to extract the lead ball was more likely to kill him than the injury itself. The bullet had found its final home. It would remain with him forever, a permanent, agonizing fixture in the architecture of his body. It became a constant source of pain, a dull, relentless ache that would sharpen into a searing agony with a deep breath or a sudden movement. The broken ribs healed imperfectly, creating a persistent irritation in the surrounding tissues. The bullet itself, a foreign object in the delicate ecosystem of his chest cavity, caused chronic inflammation and the formation of scar tissue. This internal wound, which never fully healed, was the secret source of the bloody, hacking cough that would become his lifelong companion, a constant, physical reminder of that cold dawn in Kentucky. But this bullet, a source of unending physical misery, also became the very cornerstone of his legend. The story of the duel spread like a prairie fire, growing more mythic with each retelling. It was a story of almost superhuman will and fortitude. He was not just a man who had won a duel. He was a man who had taken a direct shot to the chest from an expert marksman and had not even flinched. He had remained standing through sheer, terrifying force of will, long enough to kill his opponent with a cold and methodical precision. This incident transformed him from a mere politician into a figure of mythic proportions. On the frontier, a world that valued physical courage above all other virtues, he became a living legend. He was seen as a man with an iron will, a man who could not be broken and, it seemed, could not be killed. This was a reputation far more powerful than any political alliance or legal argument. It created an aura of invincibility around him, a sense that he was a man touched by destiny, operating on a different plane than ordinary mortals. The fear he inspired became his most potent political weapon. His opponents, both in the rough-and-tumble world of Tennessee politics and later on the national stage, knew they were not dealing with a conventional adversary. They were dealing with a man who had proven, in the most dramatic way possible, that he was willing to die to defend his honor and destroy his enemies. This knowledge had a chilling effect on his rivals. They might challenge his policies, but they were far more hesitant to challenge him personally. The memory of Charles Dickinson was a powerful deterrent. He carried his physical suffering not as a weakness, but as a badge of honor, a testament to his toughness. The pain sharpened his temper, making his famous rages even more terrifying. His political enemies would see him in the midst of a coughing fit, wiping blood from his lips with a handkerchief, and they would see not a sick, wounded man, but a wounded predator, a creature who was most dangerous when injured. His physical frailty, paradoxically, enhanced his reputation for ferocity. He was a man who lived with death every day, and therefore did not fear it. This legend of indestructibility followed him into his military career. As a general in the War of 1812 and in the Creek War, his soldiers revered him. They saw a commander who was as tough as the hickory wood of his nickname, a man who endured the same hardships as they did, and who seemed to be immune to pain and fear. His willingness to lead from the front, to expose himself to the same dangers as his men, created a bond of loyalty that was absolute. His soldiers would follow him anywhere, convinced that their grim, unkillable general would lead them to victory. Even his physical appearance contributed to the myth. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his body wasted by his chronic ailments. With his shock of unruly grey hair and his piercing, deep-set blue eyes, he looked more like an avenging ghost than a living man. His gaunt frame was a constant, visible reminder of the violence he had endured, a living testament to the fact that he had walked through the valley of death and emerged, if not unscathed, then at least unbroken. His very presence was an act of intimidation. The bullet, therefore, was both his curse and his crown. It was the source of a lifetime of physical agony, a private, personal hell that he endured every single day. But it was also the source of his public power, the dark, bloody bedrock upon which he built a political career that would take him all the way to the presidency. The man who governed the nation was a man who had mastered the art of turning his own suffering into a weapon, a man who had learned on a cold Kentucky morning that if you could conquer your own body's instinct to fall, you could conquer anyone. Having reached the pinnacle of power, he became a living paradox. By day, in the public theater of the White House, he was President Jackson, Old Hickory, the unyielding symbol of the common man's rise. He was the embodiment of an iron will, a political force of nature who waged relentless war on his perceived enemies. He vetoed bills with a flourish of defiance, stared down the Supreme Court, and dismantled the Second Bank of the United States, an institution he viewed as a bastion of aristocratic privilege and a personal affront to his own authority. His public persona was one of absolute, unwavering strength. He was the architect of Indian removal, a policy of brutal and systematic dispossession that forcibly relocated entire native nations from their ancestral lands. He pursued this policy with a single-mindedness that shocked even his supporters, deaf to the pleas for justice and the rulings of his own nation's highest court. In the public eye, he was a man without doubt, a leader who saw the world in stark, simple terms of friends and enemies, of national destiny and obstacles that must be crushed. But this was only half of the man. When night fell and the doors of the executive mansion were closed, the myth of Old Hickory would dissolve, leaving behind only Andrew, the exhausted old man. In the privacy of his bedchamber, the iron facade would crumble. He was a man tormented by his own flesh, a prisoner in a body that was a landscape of old wounds. The lead slowly poisoning his system would trigger violent, shaking fevers that left him drenched in sweat. The bullet near his heart would send waves of nauseating pain through his chest, and his nights were often spent in a sitting position, as lying down would bring on terrifying fits of suffocating coughing. His famous rage, the volcanic temper that so intimidated his political opponents, was not just a calculated political tool, it was the direct, visceral product of his constant, internal agony. The pain was a relentless furnace, and the fury was the smoke that poured from it. The determination that made him president, the refusal to back down, the willingness to destroy any institution or person who stood in his way, was fueled by this private, unending war he was waging against his own mortality. He governed with the ferocity of a man who was in too much pain to have any patience for compromise. His entire political philosophy seemed to be a projection of his own internal struggle. He saw threats everywhere because his own body was in a state of constant, painful siege. His war on the National Bank was not just a matter of economic policy. It was a personal vendetta against a powerful, faceless entity that he could not physically strike, a proxy for the lead in his flesh that he could not remove. He attacked it with the same single-mindedness with which he endured his own physical suffering, seeking to destroy the external enemy with the same ferocity he used to suppress his internal pain. Similarly, his brutal policies toward Native Americans were the actions of a man who saw the world as a zero-sum game of survival. Having grown up on a frontier where life was a constant, violent struggle, he saw the native tribes not as sovereign nations with legitimate rights, but as an existential threat to the safety and expansion of the United States, an obstacle to be removed. He pursued their removal with the cold, unsentimental logic of a man who believed that in any conflict, there could be only one victor, and that weakness was a fatal flaw. It was the same logic he applied to his own body: endure, dominate, or die. The Private Jackson was a man who leaned heavily on a small circle of trusted friends and family, a stark contrast to the imperious public figure. He was known to be capable of great tenderness, particularly toward his adopted children and his beloved, deceased wife, Rachel, whose memory he fiercely protected. This duality was the central paradox of his character. He was a man who could order the forced march of thousands of people to their deaths, and then return to his private quarters to weep over a miniature portrait of his wife. The same heart that harbored a murderous rage was also capable of a profound and lasting love. The presidency was, for him, the ultimate duel. He saw his political opponents in the same light as he had seen Charles Dickinson, as mortal enemies who had to be utterly defeated. He used the power of his office like a loaded pistol, taking aim at the institutions and individuals he despised, and pulling the trigger without hesitation. The constant pain and the ever-present awareness of his own mortality did not soften him. It made him more reckless, more determined to impose his will upon the nation before his own body finally failed him. His time in office was one of the most tumultuous in American history, a direct reflection of the man at its center. He was a figure of profound contradictions, a champion of the common man who owned slaves, a fierce nationalist who defied his own country's laws, a man of immense physical courage who was also a physical wreck. The iron will that shaped an era was, in the end, the product of a lifetime of suffering, a political legacy forged in the crucible of a private, unending agony. His presidency was the last great battle of a man who had been at war, with the world and with himself, since he was a boy. He died in the year 1845, having lived to the age of 78. His death was no surprise. To those who knew the true state of his health, the only surprise was that he had managed to live so long. He succumbed in the end to a combination of dropsy and tuberculosis, his body finally surrendering after a lifetime of abuse from both external and internal forces. He died at his beloved home, the Hermitage, surrounded by family, a patriarch of the nation he had so forcefully shaped. To the end, his will remained unbroken, even as his body failed completely. He had outlived almost all of his enemies, a fact that must have given him a grim satisfaction. He had survived duels, battles, assassination attempts, and the brutal internal war waged by the lead in his flesh. His life was a testament to the sheer, stubborn power of the human will to endure. He had faced down every threat, real or imagined, and had emerged, if not victorious over his own mortality, then at least defiant to the very last breath. He left behind a legacy that was as complex, violent, and contradictory as the man himself, a legacy that the nation would wrestle with for centuries. But the darkest secret of his survival, and of his eventual death, was not revealed until much later, through the dispassionate analysis of historical medical records and, eventually, scientific testing of his preserved hair samples. This final, grim irony was hidden in the very remedies he had used to fight his pain. The medicine of his era was a landscape of toxic substances and well-intentioned guesswork, a world where the cure was often as dangerous as the disease. And Jackson, in his desperation to quell his internal agony, had been a voracious consumer of these dangerous cures. His physicians, struggling to alleviate his suffering from what they correctly identified as the effects of lead poisoning, prescribed the most popular and powerful medications of the day. For his debilitating fevers, intestinal problems, and general malaise, they gave him large and frequent doses of calomel. Calomel was a medical miracle of the age, a ubiquitous cure-all. It was also mercurous chloride, a compound of mercury, one of the most toxic heavy metals known to man. For decades, Jackson had been systematically dosing himself with a potent neurotoxin. The mercury poisoning would have exacerbated his already volatile temperament, contributing to the violent mood swings, the paranoia, and the fits of rage that so defined his personality. It would have attacked his nervous system, causing tremors and further physical decay. As he desperately sought relief from the effects of the lead, he was unknowingly layering a second, more insidious poison on top of it, creating a toxic cocktail within his own body that would have driven a lesser man to madness or an early grave. But the catalogue of self-administered poisons did not end there. To combat the chronic diarrhea and dysentery that plague him, another common symptom of heavy metal poisoning, his doctors prescribed a remedy known as sugar of lead. This was lead acetate, a sweet-tasting compound of the very metal that was already lodged in his chest. In a desperate attempt to control one of the symptoms of his lead poisoning, he was, quite literally, eating more lead. He was pouring gasoline on the fire that was consuming him from within. And so the final, horrifying picture comes into focus. For the last several decades of his life, the man who was arguably the most powerful individual in the United States was suffering from the debilitating effects of massive, chronic poisoning from 3 separate heavy metals. The lead from his dueling wounds was the original source of his agony. The mercury from his medicine was attacking his mind and his nervous system. And the lead he was ingesting was adding to the toxic burden that was already crushing his organs. The man who had survived 100 duels, who had faced down the British Army, who had crushed Native American nations and dismantled the National Bank, had become his own most diligent executioner. His legendary iron will, the very quality that allowed him to endure the pain, was also the quality that drove him to seek relief in the poisonous cures that were killing him. He approached his medical treatments with the same aggressive, uncompromising ferocity with which he approached his political battles, convinced that he could conquer his own body's ailments through sheer force of will and chemical assault. In the end, his death was not a victory for his old enemies or a testament to the lingering power of Dickinson's bullet. It was a slow, agonizing suicide by medicine. The man who seemed unkillable by any external force was ultimately brought down by his own desperate attempts to heal himself. He died not from the bullets of other men, but from the poisons he had willingly, even eagerly, consumed in the mistaken belief that they were the cure. The ultimate warrior, the man who had never backed down from a fight, had been silently, methodically, and ironically, vanquished by his own treatment.